Chapter 8 6 months before integration. Caramel shivered. He stood on the rocky ledge and risked a look down, but it was a bit too dark to see the foot of the mountain. At best, he could only make out the dark shapes of pine trees and the lighter shades of barren rock on the sheer face of the mountainside. But in the distance, Ponyville glowed a warm yellow in the night, reminding him that a non-Pegasus had absolutely no business being on the top of a mountain so late past bedtime. A sharp, cold wind moaned in the gaps between the mountain's multiple peaks, and he shivered once more and retreated to the little cave on the other side of the ledge. Sassaflash was tending to a little campfire at the entrance, humming to the tune of one of Pinkie Pie's songs as she roasted some marshmallows on a stick. "Remind me again why we're up here?" Caramel asked as he trotted over and sat down by her side. "I wanted to show you something," she replied. He looked out and down at the valley. "It's beautiful, yeah." "That's not all I wanted to show you." Sash gestured towards the little cave behind them. "I spent quite a lot of my time up here. When I wasn't at school or work, I mean." Caramel squinted. From what he could see from the firelight, the cave was little more than a hollow in the rock. There was a narrow corner where maybe one or two could comfortably curl up in, but apart from that, it was hardly a place he would consider desirable for somepony to stay in for long. I see," he said uncertainly. "Did your mom or dad take you up here for camping or something? Seems an awful long way to come." His muscles were still aching slightly from the long, long climb. Sash grinned and nudged him in the ribs with her wing elbow. "I got these, remember?" "Ah, ticklish!" Caramel giggled and brushed her wing aside with his foreleg. "Right, duh, I forgot." "And, my parents didn't take me up here. I kind of got around on my own." Caramel raised an eyebrow. That's new. Sash was quiet for a moment and seemed to be working up the courage to tell him something. After being her special somepony for almost 5 years, he was already quite familiar with whenever she got into this mood. Hearts and Hooves Day was tomorrow, and he'd been waiting for a long time to meet her parents. She'd already met Mom and Dad, and they seemed to approve. A little too eagerly, actually. He mentally rolled his eyes as he remembered their words. "We want grandkids, Caramel." At any rate, parents and relatives were apparently a touchy subject for Sash, and since she'd never actually introduced him to any pony from her family, he could only guess that there was some history behind that. After all, 5 years was a pretty long time to not talk much about them, let alone their childhood years. But at the same time, he could feel that she was looking for the right moment, and he was sure that he could wait. He'd be there for her when she was ready. That's what friends were for, right? At length, Sash sighed softly. Caramel knew that sigh, too, along with the slight drooping of her wings and ears. Another time, then. "Well, I like this place," he said with a smile. "It's pretty homey." That seemed to lift her out of her pensiveness. "Glad that you do, 'cause we're going to spend the night in here." She lifted the stick of marshmallows and offered it to him. "Hungry? We could start on these, then move on to the rose sandwiches." He nipped off one of the slightly charred marshmallows and said, "Yeah, I kind of figured that out." "Wakey, wakey," Sash sang as she prodded him with a hoof. Give me 5 more hours," he mumbled, opening a bleary eye. The sun was already up, and its rays were shining into the cave, casting sharp shadows in the nooks and crannies. He rolled to the side and was about to go back to sleep until one particularly insistent thought managed to barge its way through his lethargy. The sun was already up. Caramel sat bolt upright and groaned. "Oh, rats! I'm sorry. You wanted to catch the sunrise, didn't you?" Sash simply shrugged her wings. "I did at first, but I kind of overslept too." She then smiled and rummaged through her saddlebags. "But that wasn't what I wanted to show you today." "Oh?" Sash pulled out a bunch of apples and carrots and tossed them over to him. "Breakfast first, then you'll see." Caramel could tell that Sash was unusually excited. She wolfed down her breakfast and busied herself with her saddlebags once more. Her every movement seemed to quiver with anticipation, and as he finished off his food, he realized that she was inspecting an assortment of straps and buckles, though for what purpose he couldn't tell. No wonder her saddlebags were so bulky. Sash continued to work, checking her equipment with a single-mindedness that didn't end even after he was done with breakfast. Eventually he said, are those mountain climbing gear? Are we headed to the summit or something?
Nah, we're going back down.
Caramel glanced at the misty valley, bathed in the morning sunlight, then turned back to Sash. Over the sheer cliff? Can't we just take the same path that we used to get up here yesterday? Sash chuckled and shook her head.
Nope, we're not climbing.
She then grabbed the tangle of straps and buckles and lifted them up. They unraveled as she did so, and he noticed that they looked like a pair of harnesses. I'm still not sure what you're getting at, he admitted.
We're flying.
She cracked a mischievous grin and tossed a pair of goggles at him.
I got this from Cloudsdale. Remember that time you said you always wanted to know what flying was like? Well, now's your chance. Just put this on and leave the rest to me.
Caramel caught the goggles, but he suddenly felt dizzy. Maybe this was some residual magic from that time when Twilight Sparkle's spell made all the mares in town go crazy for some old doll. Big Mac was skimpy on the details, but he'd mentioned that Sash had actually fought him for custody of the odd toy. He looked back at the panoramic view and gulped. It was a long way down. Are you sure this is safe? He asked with a nervous smile.
Yeah, it's a flight harness. Pegasi use it for training those who are too afraid to learn to fly on their own, to help them get used to being in the air. The colt or filly is strapped to the grown-up and off they go. I just needed to get an adult-sized one for you.
But are you strong enough to carry me? Caramel looked her over. Her wings were in good shape as far as he could tell as a non-Pegasus, and she seemed fit enough, but he wasn't exactly a colt anymore. Sash was unfazed.
Yep, I've been practicing for almost 6 months straight. I can easily carry Granny Smith's cooking pot, which I borrowed, from Sweet Apple Acres all the way to town and back without needing to land.
Caramel tilted his head slightly to one side. A pot.
It's a big one. More like a cauldron, actually.
It's a pot. He wasn't sure if this was some subtle joke that he wasn't getting.
It's heavy enough.
She favored him with another reassuring smile.
If I can manage that huge thing with powered flight, a simple glide down from a height with you should be a trot in the park.
Not a joke then. Somewhere at the back of his mind, he was aware of a tiny spark of excitement that was threatening to grow into full-blown enthusiasm for the crazy plan. He bit his lip and shifted nervously. Was there any safe way for him to back out of this? Sash's smile wavered a little.
Come on, it'll be fun. I promise I'll keep you safe.
Caramel gazed into her eyes and saw that she really meant it. But still...
You once helped me learn to swim. I think I'd like to return the favor. Trust me.
She's got me there, he thought. He'd been wondering when she'd pull that card out. After a moment of silence, he gave her a small smile and put on the goggles. Sash wasn't the reckless type. She wouldn't have planned this and brought him up all the way if she wasn't sure she could do it. Besides, hearing her whoop of delight when he agreed to her plan probably made the whole thing worth it. After some minor hassle with putting everything on, Caramel found himself crouching low on the ledge with Sassaflash standing directly over him with her legs on either side of him. Their harnesses were linked very closely to avoid excessive swaying in flight, but that also meant that outside of flight, they were in a position that would have been considered awkward at the very least. If he straightened up even a little, she'd be lying on top of him. Why do I get the feeling that we look a bit ridiculous? He wondered aloud.
Because we probably do. Guess we're lucky that no ponies around to see us.
We're on the second tallest mountain around here, he pointed out. Any pony looking up can see us.
Nah, we're too high up right now.
Sash squared her shoulders and flapped her wings experimentally. Those few flaps were pretty powerful. She rose in the air, and Caramel felt the harness go taut as she lifted him up. He resisted the urge to flail and get back on solid ground, and instead allowed his legs to dangle freely. It was a little humbling to feel that she was the only one in control, and he was only along for the ride. Sash maintained the hover for almost a full minute, beating her wings in steady, regular strokes. Eventually, she settled back on the mountain, right at the edge of their rocky outcrop.
Warm-up's over. You ready for this?
She asked excitedly. Caramel was happy to note that she didn't sound out of breath. "Don't give me time to answer that," he replied. "Just do it before I change my... We're falling!" His cry of surprise became a silent scream as the wind roared in his ears. But after a second or two, he heard Sash grunt and their direction promptly shifted to a swift downward glide. The incline was gentle, even though their speed was still considerable. Clouds whipped past them, and when he looked behind, the ledge from which they jumped was already far behind, shrinking away. He spared a glance upwards and saw Sash's wings spread wide, teal feathers stiffly fluttering in the breeze. She gave him a smug grin when she saw him looking. Yeah, I guess that wasn't so bad," he said. She raised an eyebrow and leaned closer, cocking an ear. "That wasn't too bad," he half shouted so she could hear through the roaring wind.
Told you,
she yelled back. Caramel felt an irrepressible grin coming on as he took in the world far, far below him. Lakes and ponds looked like smooth, blue mirrors set into the green carpet of forests and meadows, with the occasional outcropping of rock here and there. Cottages and huts looked like toys from such a height. The morning mist was rapidly clearing, except for the area to the east of Ponyville, where the clouds hung heavy over the gloomy, everfree forest. A flock of birds were flying far beneath in a V pattern, oblivious to the fact that there was an earth pony directly above them. "I'm flying! Sweet Celestia, I'm flying!" Slowly, he lifted his legs until they were in alignment with the air current whooshing past them, and the hairs on his forelegs actually rippled from the force of the wind. He could feel its substantial tug on his mane and tail as well. Come to think of it, that was probably why she'd given him the goggles. He wouldn't have been able to gaze at the view quite so easily without them. He'd have to squint against the wind like Sash was doing. A glimmer on the surface of a lake below caught his eye, and on a whim, he shifted his weight and leaned a little to the side to try to get a better look. To his surprise, their angle shifted. He shifted the other way, and they tilted in that direction in response. Caramel's eyes widened. It was as if Sash was adjusting her glide to mimic his movements. He looked up and found her smiling as if she'd just given a foal a really nice present.
Go ahead, Cadet Caramel. You get to drive,
she said.
Let's see if you're Wonderbolt material.
He grinned and threw his weight to one side and gasped in surprise as Sash held him tight with her forelegs and did a barrel roll. It took him a moment of rapid breathing to recover from that, but his glee returned quickly enough.
Come on, you can do better than that,
she yelled. Caramel complied, and he let loose a whoop of joy as Sash pulled him up into an aerial somersault. He tried various maneuvers, doing his level best to mimic the moves that he'd seen the Wonderbolts do on their performances. Of course, there was no way that a Pegasus and an Earth Pony could do all of that strapped together, but he thought that the dives, rolls, and spirals were more than any pony could ask for. For a moment, he truly felt like a Wonderbolt. All too soon, it was time for the ride to end. Ponyville was rapidly approaching, and he could tell that Sash was already tiring. Hang on, how are we gonna land? He thought as they rapidly descended. Sash answered that for him easily enough.
Brace yourself,
she said as they swooped past the rooftops of the tallest shop houses towards the town park. Caramel grit his teeth as the ground rushed up to meet them, but Sash pulled up at the last second and beat her wings rapidly, creating a strong downdraft that blew dirt and grass in a circle, allowing them to descend more slowly. She suddenly stopped when they were about 3 tail lengths above the grass, and he landed heavily on all fours.
Phew. So, what do you think?
Sash asked as she lay panting on his back.
Still think it was crazy? Or was it totally worth it?
Caramel chuckled and nuzzled her on the cheek as he carried her over to the nearest tree for shade.
Can't it be both? That was... I don't know. There's nothing like it. It was great.
You were great.
Well, you did pretty well yourself. You're a natural.
Caramel rolled his eyes. You're bluffing. Sash smiled back.
Well, maybe just a little bit. If you had wings, I think with a little practice you'd be able to give Rainbow Dash a flight for her money.
Caramel rubbed his mane in embarrassment at her exaggeration. He then glanced around and felt his ears and cheeks heat up.
Come on,
he said as he sat on his haunches to set her hind hooves back on the ground.
Let's get out of this rig. I think ponies are looking at us.
Sash followed his eyes and chuckled.
Yeah, wouldn't want to give them funny ideas.
18 days before integration. Caramel had one side of his face squashed against the rocky floor. He could taste grainy dirt mixed with sweat on his tongue.
What am I doing here?
The world felt like it was swaying to and fro slowly, and everything was dull and muted, as if he was underwater. But that couldn't be right. He could breathe, albeit somewhat raggedly. When he opened his eyes, dark shapes surged in the air above him, and when they collided, there was an accompanying dull thud.
Something's wrong.
Pain started seeping into his consciousness. He could feel it somewhere on the left side of his head. He tried to feel it with a hoof, but his foreleg felt like it was made of granite. He grimaced as the pain sharpened and a rapid thumping filled his skull.
Wait.
He remembered. Something about strange, rough voices echoing through the tunnels. Yellow eyes, snarls, chirping, loud shrieks of alarm, rancid stink. A massive shape charging towards him.
Diamond dogs!
He gasped. Clarity returned with a rush as the weight pressing down on his senses lifted. Sounds seemed to speed up and sharpen, and he realized that the rapid thumping inside his head was actually blood from his racing heart. The dark shape in his foggy vision coalesced, shrinking from an amorphous cloud into more curved and angular features. He blinked once, and a changeling was suddenly looming over him.
"Oh good, you're still alive,"
said Rax as he backed away to give Caramel some space. Caramel tried to get up, and to his relief found that he could move again. He got onto all fours, heard a rapid series of scraping sounds, turned his head, and gasped when he saw a massive, furry brute hurtling towards him, claws outstretched. Luckily for him, his training finally kicked back into action, and he dropped low before the diamond dog could rake his face off. Its claws passed over his head, and he quickly unleashed a burst of energy on its back as its momentum carried it past him. The shot was weaker than he liked, but it was still enough to make the diamond dog lose its balance and crash snout first to the floor. He readied another magical blast as the dog got back onto its feet. Or tried to. Rax had flown over it and smashed onto its back with all 4 hooves when it was halfway up. The cracking thud that followed made Caramel wince, but the diamond dog suddenly rolled, unbalanced Rax, and grabbed his neck with a massive paw. The changeling bit down hard, drawing blood, but the diamond dog didn't let go. In fact, it grinned, and as its paw tensed, Rax's eyes went wide. The sight of his friend flailing in the choking grip shocked Caramel back into action.
Let go, you freak!
He bellowed, sending a fiery blast straight at its chest. Rax fell to the floor in a gasping heap as the diamond dog crashed into a stalagmite, bounced over it, and rolled until it was stopped by the wall. Caramel dashed over to Rax, and he could smell the sour stink of singed fur hovering over him.
I'm fine, idiot! Stop it!
His friend rasped, pointing a hoof at the diamond dog. Caramel hesitated for a second, but decided that restraining the beast was more important at the moment. It wasn't out cold yet. He broke into a gallop, releasing the tension in his glands at the same time. By the time the trickling sensation inside his legs had begun, he was upon the diamond dog. It growled and swiped at him, but its aim was poor and he easily leapt over it. When he landed on his back, he proceeded to slather the viscous fluid oozing out of his pores all over its limbs, starting with its front paws. The resin was quick to harden, but not quite quickly enough to stop it from reaching out with one paw to grab his hoof, snapping several strands of the sticky stuff in the process.
Yikes!
He tried to pull away, but it wouldn't let go, and its claws dug painfully into his foreleg as it squeezed. A second later, a pair of hooves came crashing down on the muscular limb, and the diamond dog howled in pain. Rax had leaped and stomped on it mercilessly. "Thanks," Caramel muttered as they spread more resin over the brute. Rax grunted in response. The diamond dog growled again and tried to break free. The resin stretched, and for a moment Caramel thought that it wouldn't hold, but in the next moment the greenish strands snapped back into position as the dog relented. It glared at him balefully and spat out something that sounded like a dirty word.
Go help the others. I'll finish up here.
Rax snapped. Caramel made to leave, but stopped when he caught sight of the fractured plates on Rax's neck. They looked like they were bending inwards slightly. Come to think of it, his voice did sound rather strained. "You're hurt," he said.
And you're wasting time. Quit staring and get back to fighting.
Rax retorted. He coughed once, then frowned and added,
Or did that thing manage to punch out your brain?
His hoof instinctively went up to the throbbing lump on the side of his head. "Oh, that's where that came from." He also realized that Rax was getting annoyed with him, so he quickly turned tail and headed back into the tunnel from which they'd come. His mind raced as he recalled what had happened in the past few minutes. Diamond dogs. He'd been on patrol with Rax when someone raised the alarm. The dogs had dug a tunnel up into one of the lower chambers and clashed with some of the guards, probably trying to expand their territory or something. Whatever the case, when he and Rax had rushed to help, it had become clear that these diamond dogs were far nastier than the ones he'd heard about on the surface. These were dirtier, larger, and more wolf-like in appearance, and they only spoke in some language that he didn't recognize. The ones on the surface were known to speak equestrian at times. Also, it had become painfully apparent that they could easily kill any lone changeling. This dog alone had managed to push him and Rax this far down this particular tunnel. Two other warriors joined him from adjacent tunnels as he galloped back towards the point of incursion, and sounds of battle became audible.
"There you are. Where's Thorax?"
asked Scritch. "Back the other way,"
Is he okay? We came as soon as we heard.
Chitin piped up. "He says he's fine. We've got bigger problems to worry about." Caramel found a scene of chaos when he leapt out of the tunnel and into the lower chamber. There were almost a dozen or so diamond dogs armed with various clubs and axes, engaged in combat with nearly twice as many changelings. Although they had the advantage of numbers, the smallest diamond dog looked easily thrice the weight of any one of them, and their weapons appeared well used. Caramel could see a few motionless changelings lying on the floor, and only one diamond dog had been dragged to a corner and ensnared with resin. Chitin and Scritch charged forward without hesitation, but Caramel lingered. For a moment, he was paralyzed with indecision. But then, he heard a resonant hiss echo from the tunnel behind him, and his next breath made his blood rise and his doubts melt away. It had been a while since he'd experienced it, and although he'd promised himself not to be taken by it again, he couldn't think of a better time to break that promise. He cracked a grin as the combat pheromones coursed through him, firing up his senses and dulling his pain. Chrysalis is coming. Caramel leaped into the fray and bucked a dog that had been about to brain a changeling with its club and scorched its side with a beam of fiery magic before it could get up. Its howls of pain made him giddy with excitement. The other changelings were quickly being affected by the pheromones as well. Everything became a blur of action as the warriors whipped themselves into a frenzy, leaping onto the dogs to bite, buck, or burn with magic. Caramel did his part by joining those who were adept at magic, providing fire support whilst clinging to the ceiling, safely out of reach and blasting away at the dogs with his now considerable reserves of energy. But even with their redoubled efforts, the dogs were not easy to take down. Many of them carried on fighting even when their flesh was torn or smoking, and Caramel was aware in some small part at the back of his mind that he was horrified by the sight of a massive, brown-furred diamond dog smashing Chitin on the head with its club. She went down and didn't get back up. Caramel tried to rush to her and see if she was okay, but paused when he saw a lanky dog looking at him. He couldn't see its eyes through the narrow slits on its roughshod, bucket-like helmet, but it was obvious that he had its attention. It snarled and brandished its club at him.
You want some, eh?
He sent a blast of green fire its way, but it was ready. It leaped aside and hurled its club straight at him.
Oh, pony fat.
The heavy block of wood struck him in the chest. He thought he heard a crunch just as all the air was driven out of his lungs, and he lost his grip and dropped from the ceiling like a stunned insect. Fortunately, he'd not been directly over the dog or he would have been a goner. Instead, his fall was broken by a fellow changeling.
Get off me, you idiots!
Hissed Overseer Skihar.
Why does every pony like calling me that so much?
He thought, half dazed as he lay on top of her. Skihar was wearing her usual carapace-like armor, and there was a black spear lying on the ground beside her. When he didn't react to her warning, she shoved him off and levitated the spear, thrusting it straight at the diamond dog that had dislodged him from his perch.
So many. This is crazy.
Then Caramel remembered what had happened to Chitin, and he leaped back onto all fours and weaved his way through the battle, dodging blows and scorching enemies whenever he found an opportunity. She had only been less than 20 tail lengths away, but it seemed far longer than that with all the chaos around him. He saw the dog that had bashed her rake Scritch in the side before punching another warrior senseless. Then, it shifted its attention back to Chitin, its face twisted into a feral snarl. It hefted its club as it trudged towards her, as if it was going to finish her off.
Hayseed, she's unconscious.
Caramel tried to gallop, but suddenly found that his legs refused to go any faster. He also found that his muscles were burning, and that funny, wheezy noise he'd been hearing was actually coming from his lungs. As he collapsed to the floor, he cried out,
Somebody help her!
The diamond dog was standing directly over her. Caramel fired a blast of magic at it, but in his current state, his aim was so poor that the diamond dog merely looked at the scorch mark on the ceiling above it, then spared him a glance and chuckled. It lifted its club for the final blow, and he saw that the gnarled, heavy wood was glistening with dark, changeling blood. But before it could bring it down and crush her, a blinding beam of green energy struck it squarely in the back and sent it flying off to the far side of the chamber. Its club clattered to the floor. Caramel turned towards the source of the blast and felt his heart leap. He'd never been so happy to see her before.
Paws off my children, you vermin!
Chrysalis bellowed in a rippling, resonant voice. Caramel winced, hoping that the ringing in his ears wasn't a sign of permanent damage. At the sight of the livid queen, one of the dogs howled something out to its companions, and the half-dozen or so that were still standing began to beat a hasty retreat. Caramel attempted to rise and give chase with his fellow warriors, but fell down with a gasp as pain shot through his chest. Hooves thundered and wings buzzed all around him as everyone swarmed past him towards the fleeing dogs. It was all he could do to focus on breathing and not passing out. Chrysalis's arrival had pretty much put an end to the skirmish. She was simply too powerful for the Diamond Dogs. One of them lay in a crumpled, whimpering heap, its limbs twisted in unnatural angles and its tail in a literal, bloody knot, thoroughly smeared in green resin. The unlucky few to have still been in range of her magic as they retreated had been dragged back and quickly engulfed in a swarm of changelings.